if you break your arm, right? An X-ray gives you this really clean binary answer. It's either broken or it's not broken.
Yeah.
It's purely structural reality. And the doctor just sort of points to that jagged white line on the film and says, there it is. But, how exactly do you take an X-ray of a child's tantrum?
Right. You really can't.
Or, how do you take a snapshot of a habit someone has been trying to break for a decade? You just
Right.
can't. You step into these really murky waters of human learning and behavior where, honestly, guessing simply is not good enough. And the only flashlight you really have in the dark is objective, continuous data.
It's the ultimate diagnostic challenge, I think, because we are dealing with these incredibly dynamic, just constantly shifting human variables.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why the tools we use to measure and evaluate behavior, they can't just be anecdotal, like, oh, he seemed better today.
Yeah.
They have to be mathematically and really visually rigorous.
Totally. So, welcome to this deep dive into the mechanics of applied behavior analysis, or ABA. Whether you are prepping for your BCBA exam, or maybe you're catching up on behavioral science, or honestly, if you are just insanely curious about how we actually quantify and change human behavior, you are in the exact right place.
Yeah, we're going straight into the architecture of behavior change today.
We really are. We're dissecting the exact tools that practitioners use to prove their interventions are, actually working. And the mission for today's deep dive is heavily inspired by the show Behavioral Intelligence con Mara Sánchez.
Oh, absolutely. Great show.
Yeah. So we are focusing intensely on BCBA Foundation's D.6. For those of you studying out there, that's the section dedicated to critiquing and interpreting data from single-case experimental designs.
Which is a huge topic.
Huge. We are looking at how to evaluate level, trend, and variability, how to determine if experimental control actually exists, and, crucially, how to spot common mistakes when evaluating behavioral data.
And we have a really robust stack of sources to pull from for this. We're cross-referencing a whole collection of BCBA mock exams, the official ethical guidelines for behavior analysts, and excerpts from foundational texts in the field, specifically the classic Cooper, Heron, and Heward book.
The Holy Grail. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to prove that a treatment plan is effective, we have to look at how we format the data. Right? Like, if a practitioner has a massive spreadsheet full of frequency counts, say, I don't know, how many times a client exhibited aggressive behavior over a whole month, why take the extra kind of tedious step of plotting it all out on a line graph?
It's a really valid question.
Because it seems like an outdated extra step,
Yeah.
Especially in an era of automated data dashboards and AI.
Well, the Cooper text actually specifically addresses why behavior analysis relies so heavily on visual analysis rather than, say, complex statistical tests. Graphic displays just offer undeniable immediate benefits.
Okay, like what?
Well, when you plot data on a graph, you are creating an immediate visual record. And that allows a practitioner to explore behavioral variations in real time. You do not have to wait until the end of a quarter to run some massive statistical regression.
Oh, I see. So it's more like a living document. It functions as an active feedback loop while you're treating the client.
Exactly. The sources note that graphs serve as judgment aids. Because, think about it, in a lot of fields, researchers rely on p-values and statistical significance to prove an effect, right?
Yeah, the classic less than 0.05 metric.
Right. But statistical significance doesn't always equal clinical significance.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you might run a study and prove that an intervention statistically reduced a severe self-injurious behavior by, 3%. And mathematically, statistically, that is real. But clinically, that is totally useless to the client.
Right. They're still injuring themselves almost exactly as much.
Exactly. So visual analysis is inherently conservative. If an intervention is truly effective, the change on the graph should be obvious to the naked eye. You shouldn't have to squint or run an algorithm to see it.
It essentially demands a slam dunk.
Yes.
But to recognize that slam dunk, we have to understand the 3 core dimensions of visual analysis. So let's look at a clinical scenario from the sources. Let's imagine we are tracking a client who engages in severe biting.
Okay.
If we just look at the daily average, that is our first dimension, right? Level.
Yes, level. So level refers to the position of the data on the vertical axis, the axis. It basically shows the overall height of the data path.
Right.
Like, is the client biting 50 times a day or 5 times a day? That average height is your level. But, and this is crucial, you have to be incredibly careful with how that level is presented.
Get at the scale, right?
Exactly. The scale of the graph can dramatically alter your perception.
Right, because if I manipulate the scale of that vertical axis, say, I change the range from 0 to 100, and I squish it down to just 0 to 10. Suddenly, a minor fluctuation of like 2 bytes looks like a massive volatile mountain range.
Which is a really common mistake students and practitioners make when they're critiquing single-case data.
They just look at the line.
Yep, they look at the shape of the line without checking the parameters of the axis.
Yeah,
You have to anchor yourself to the actual numbers before you judge the level.
that makes total sense. Then we have the second dimension, which is trend. This is just the overall direction of the data path over time.
Right.
So is the biting behavior increasing? Is it decreasing? Or is it showing a zero trend, meaning it's basically staying relatively flat?
And then the third dimension is variability. This is really about the spread of the data.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
So how consistent are those data points in relation to each other? Are they tightly clustered around that trend line, forming a highly predictable pattern? Or are they just bouncing wildly from 0 to 50 and then back to 0 from one session to the next?
I'm going to try to map this onto something outside of the clinic just to make it stick.
Go for it.
It operates exactly like tracking a stock market portfolio.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so the level is your current stock price. The trend is whether you are in a bull market going up or a bear market going down. And the variability is the market volatility, like how wildly the price swings day to day.
That's a great analogy.
But here's the catch, right? A CEO cannot just look at a rising stock price, the trend, and automatically take credit for it. They have to actually prove that their new product launch caused the spike and that it wasn't just, a general economic boom.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the perfect way to conceptualize it. In behavior analysis, seeing a decreasing trend in problem behavior is a fantastic observation. But correlation is not causation.
Right, they might have just started a new medication or moved to a new house.
Exactly. We have to scientifically prove that our specific intervention, and not some random environmental change, caused that trend. We basically need to run a behavioral audit.
Which brings us to baseline logic. This is how we move from simply observing a graph to establishing what the sources call a functional relationship.
Yes.
Meaning we proved the treatment caused the change. And there are 3 pillars here: prediction, verification, and replication.
The big 3.
So let's start with prediction. Before implementing any treatment, you collect baseline data to observe the behavior in its natural state, right? And the sources emphasize that you need steady state responding here.
You absolutely do. You cannot accurately predict the trajectory of a bouncing ball.
That's a good way to put it.
If the baseline data is wildly variable, any prediction you make is just a total guess. But if a student is, say, calling out in class exactly 10 times an hour, day after day, in a highly stable pattern, well, your prediction is that tomorrow, without intervention, they will probably call out about 10 times.
Okay, so if I predict it will stay bad, and then I implement a differential reinforcement program, that's my treatment, and the calling out drops to like 2 times an hour, I have a new trend.
You do.
But to definitively prove my treatment caused it, verification would logically mean I have to turn off the treatment. I have to remove the reinforcement program and see if the behavior goes back to being bad, right?
That is standard verification in an ABA reversal design, yes.
Yes.
You withdraw the independent variable to verify your prediction.
But wait, hold on. Applying that logic to a kid calling out in class is fine, but what happens when we apply that to the biting scenario or severe self-injury?
Yes.
If we finally get a dangerous behavior to stop using a specific treatment, turning off the treatment just to satisfy the rules of verification seems entirely unethical. Like you are literally taking away the life raft just to prove to yourself that the water is deep.
That is such a critical tension in the field, and you are spot on. But the ethical guidelines prioritize client safety way above demonstrating experimental control.
Okay, thank goodness.
For dangerous behaviors, behavior analysts avoid prolonged return to baseline designs. Instead, the sources outline alternative single-case designs. One is the BAB design.
So you start with the treatment immediately. You throw the life raft first. That's the first B.
Yes. Once the dangerous behavior is stabilized and safely managed, you might conduct a very brief, highly monitored withdrawal, that's the A phase.
Just to see.
Just long enough to verify the behavior begins to increase, and then you immediately reinstate the treatment, which is the final B.
That makes a lot more sense. And another option mentioned in the sources is the multi-element design or alternating treatments design.
A very powerful tool.
Right, because instead of withdrawing treatment completely, you are essentially running rapid-fire A/B testing.
Yes.
You might alternate between two different interventions really rapidly, sometimes even within the same day. So you never leave the client in an untreated state, but you still get to compare the data paths to see which treatment is suppressing the behavior best.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the ethical trap of a prolonged baseline while still establishing experimental control. And that actually leads to the third pillar, which is replication.
Right.
This is simply reintroducing the intervention and getting the exact same successful outcome. If you take the treatment away and the behavior worsens, then you put it back and the behavior improves again. You have replicated the effect. You've proven that your independent variable is actually controlling the dependent variable.
And the source material provides some really fantastic, concrete, clinical examples of this in action, particularly when looking at functional analyses, or FAs.
FAs are essential to understand for the exam.
Yeah, these are the gold standard assessments where practitioners systematically manipulate the environment to test hypotheses about why a behavior is happening, right?
Right.
Like, is it for attention, to escape a demand, to access an item, or is it automatic? Here's where it gets really interesting. The mock exams detail a case study involving a client named Anatoly.
I remember this one.
Yeah, so the graph plots his self-injurious behavior across 4 different controlled conditions. Now, in the play condition, which serves as a control, and the alone condition and the attention condition, the data paths are just hovering near 0. They're totally flat.
Right.
But in the academic demand condition, the data path completely separates from all the others. It spikes massively and stays high.
The visual analysis there is completely unambiguous. The academic work is presented, the behavior occurs, the work is removed. His behavior functions as an escape from demands. The graph literally tells the entire clinical story right there.
It's so clean.
It is. But then the sources present Elena's case.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, if Anatoly's graph is a clean story, Elena's graph is total chaos. Her data is highly variable across every single condition.
Like, all of them?
All of them. Demand, play, alone, attention. The data points are just overlapping and bouncing everywhere. At first glance, it looks like the assessment completely failed to find the trigger.
Right, because nothing is separating out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that interpreting single-case experimental data requires deep clinical nuance. That chaos. It is not a failure of the assessment. The chaos is the data.
Really? How?
Because when behavior occurs at highly variable, similar rates across the board, regardless of what environmental demands or consequences you manipulate, it strongly suggests the behavior has an automatic or sensory function.
Oh, wow. So the environment isn't controlling it at all. Her internal state is. Like,
yes.
It feels good to her, or maybe it relieves some internal physical discomfort, so she engages in it regardless of who is in the room or what they're doing.
Precisely. The lack of differentiation between the test conditions tells the practitioner to stop looking at external consequences and start looking inward. Perhaps looking at sensory integration or even ruling out underlying medical issues.
That is such a crucial takeaway. But, analyzing these graphs isn't just a clinical exercise for the analysts in a vacuum. The sources bring up a scenario regarding stakeholder communication that highlights a really massive psychological barrier.
Recency bias.
Yes, recency bias. So imagine a BCBA has been working on decreasing a child's biting behavior for 3 months. They have a binder full of continuous, beautiful data. But the parents pull the BCBA aside, incredibly frustrated, and they say, "We don't believe this treatment is working. He bit his brother again yesterday."
It's such a profound challenge in applied settings because human memory heavily overweights recent, highly emotional events.
It's totally natural.
Right, if a parent dealt with a traumatic biting incident that morning, their emotional reality is that the intervention is a complete failure, even if the data shows the overall rate of biting has dropped by, say, 80% over the last quarter.
And you cannot just look at a stressed, exhausted parent and say, "Well, trust me, the spreadsheet looks better."
No, you definitely can't do that.
This is why the sources explicitly recommend utilizing line graphs to show the trend, not pie charts, which are practically useless for demonstrating behavior change over time and not just showing them raw tally marks. A line graph visually defeats recency bias.
Because it forces the viewer to acknowledge the entire timeline, not just that one isolated event from yesterday.
Exactly. The parents might be entirely fixated on the level the fact that the biting hasn't reached 0 yet. But a clear downward sloping trend line is undeniable visual proof of progress.
It really is.
It provides this visual anchor that proves the overall trajectory is moving in the right direction, which is essential for maintaining stakeholder buy-in during what is often a pretty grueling behavior change process.
It is grueling. But, and this is a big but, knowing the trend doesn't matter if your ruler is broken.
Oh, yes.
This brings us to a really critical vulnerability in the entire system of visual analysis, which is data integrity. Because an impeccably drawn graph is completely useless if the data feeding it is flawed.
So let's look at how measurement artifacts can completely warp these graphs. An artifact is essentially a mathematical illusion, right? It's data that appears to show a specific level or trend, but only because of the way it was measured, not because of what the behavior is actually doing in reality. And the sources highlight discontinuous measurement procedures as major culprits here.
Right. When you cannot observe a client continuously all day, which is most of the time you use discontinuous measurement, you observe only during specific samples of time. And the two most prominent methods here are whole interval recording and partial interval recording.
Yeah.
Let's examine the mechanics of how they actually distort reality.
Okay, take whole interval recording. Let's say we are tracking a student who continuously taps their pencil on the desk, right?
Right.
And we are using 15-second intervals as our lens.
Okay.
In whole interval recording, you only score the behavior if it happens for the entire uninterrupted duration of those 15 seconds. So if the student taps their pencil for 14.9 seconds and stops for literally a tenth of a second, the rules of whole interval recording force you to record a 0 for that block of time.
It's wild, but it's true. It creates a false negative. The behavior was highly prevalent. I mean, they were tapping almost the whole time, but the measurement tool logged it as completely non-existent.
Right.
Because of this mechanical flaw, whole interval recording inherently underestimates the actual occurrence of behavior. It practically requires an impossible perfection to even register on the graph.
So partial interval recording must be the opposite mathematical distortion, right?
Yes.
In partial interval, if the behavior happens at any point during that 15-second block, even for a single second, the alarm sounds and the entire interval is marked as an occurrence.
Exactly. A 1-second blur of behavior triggers a positive score for the entire observation window. Therefore, partial interval recording consistently overestimates the behavior.
Wow. So if a practitioner chooses the wrong measurement system, they're setting themselves up for complete clinical failure.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if you use partial interval recording for a behavior you are desperately trying to decrease, your graph is going to artificially inflate the data. You will look at the visual analysis and feel like a failure, assuming the intervention isn't working, when in reality, the behavior is actually decreasing. But your measurement tool is just too sensitive to capture the nuance.
Which is exactly why matching the measurement tool to the specific dimension of the behavior is one of the most vital skills tested on the BCBA exam.
It's not just trivia, it changes the outcome.
It changes everything. But there is actually a factor even more destructive than choosing the wrong measurement interval, and the ethics sourcebook addresses it directly.
Okay, what is it?
The human element of data collection.
Oh, right. This is where we look at the psychological realities of the clinic. The ethics text outlines these really troubling scenarios regarding data fabrication.
It's tough to read, honestly.
It describes an RBT, a registered behavior technician running fast-paced discrete trial training. And instead of recording the data trial by trial as it actually happens, they wait until the end of the session to quickly, quote-unquote, estimate what occurred over the past hour.
It is a direct violation of the ethical code requiring the accurate implementation of data collection procedures. I mean, in a high-stress, fast-paced clinical environment, human memory is astonishingly fallible.
You can't remember what happened 3 minutes ago, let alone an hour.
Exactly. Estimating data at the end of an hour isn't just sloppy, it is functionally fabricating data. It strips the graph of all validity.
And the sources detail an even more systemic failure, which is staff literally filling out a week's worth of data sheets on a Monday before the sessions even take place.
Unbelievable.
Now, it's easy to just read that and say, well, obviously that's unethical, but think about the chain reaction of that falsified tally mark. The technician fakes the data because of, say, administrative pressure or burnout. The BCBA then takes that fake data and plots it on a beautiful line graph. The visual analysis of that graph shows a decreasing trend.
And based on that fabricated trend, the BCBA makes a clinical decision to terminate a treatment program that the client might still desperately need. Or conversely, they continue a failing intervention that is causing the client immense frustration.
The ripple effect is huge.
The entire architecture of the behavioral intervention collapses because the foundational data point was just a lie.
So, given all this, when you, the listener, are staring at a complicated graph on a board exam or sitting in a high-pressure clinical review meeting, how do you synthesize all of this without getting completely overwhelmed by the potential for artifacts or just the sheer volume of data points?
Well, the study materials offer a highly practical exam tip for this exact moment. When you are presented with a single case design graph, always zoom out before you zoom in. Evaluate the big picture narrative first.
So do not immediately look at the difference between session 4 and session 5.
Correct. Look at the entire graph and verbally identify the 3 dimensions to yourself. What is the overall level? Is the trend moving up or down? Is the data stable or is it highly variable?
Get the lay of the land.
Yes. Grasping that baseline visual narrative gives you the required context. Only after you understand the story the graph is telling should you actually read the specific multiple choice question being asked.
Zoom out before you zoom in. I love that. Okay, let's pull all of this together. We started by defining the architecture of visual analysis, level, trend, and variability. We looked at how baseline logic, that whole audit process of prediction, verification, and replication, forced us to prove that our interventions are the actual cause of behavior change.
And utilizing alternative designs like the multi-element to prioritize client safety.
Yes, absolutely. We examine how the chaos of a highly variable functional analysis graph can actually accurately point to an automatic function, and how a simple trend line can cut through a stakeholder's recency bias to prove clinical progress.
And finally, we dissected the mechanics of measurement artifacts, seeing exactly how the math of interval recording can create illusions on a graph and how the human element of data estimation can corrupt the entire clinical process.
We spend so much time in this field analyzing the fallibility of human behavior, but we have to remember that the data collection process itself is currently completely reliant on human behavior.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it?
It really is. Which leaves us with a fascinating, kind of forward-looking question to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. We just discussed how partial interval recording and human memory limitations create these massive measurement artifacts. We rely on humans with clipboards or tablets who are prone to bias and fatigue to tell us if a behavior happened.
Right.
But as technology rapidly advances, how long until continuous AI-driven biometric wearables and automated environmental sensors make these manual measurement artifacts completely obsolete?
Oh, it's coming.
What happens to single-case experimental design when the human error of data collection is entirely removed from the equation? Will our graphs look cleaner, or will we just discover new technological artifacts we haven't even conceived of yet?
You know, the Cooper text reminds us that replication, the act of repeating an experiment and getting the same result, is the ultimate self-correcting mechanism of science. It is not the inherent honesty or infallibility of the scientist that makes ABA trustworthy, but the fact that the data can be replicated.
Wow.
So as we move into this tech-driven future, as you go out into the world, you have to ask yourself, are you trusting a one-off result, or are you looking for the replication? It is a profound shift on the horizon for the entire field of behavior analysis.
Truly something to mull over as you review your study materials. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into BCBA Foundation's D.6. A massive thank you to behavioral intelligence con Mara Sánchez for inspiring today's focus.
A fantastic resource.
Yes, and for more resources or to connect with them directly, you can visit www.amethysttherapyservices.com or reach out via email at info@amethysttherapyservices.com.
It has been an absolute pleasure examining the data with you.
Stay tuned for our next deep dive, where we will be continuing this exact journey by tackling D.7, types of single-case experimental designs. Until then, remember, when you are trying to understand the murky waters of human behavior, don't just look for a broken bone. Look at the trend, question the measurement, and let the data tell you the real story. See you next time.